I first want to start with some acknowledgements. Kisimani to our creation, our creator. The elders that happen to be here, elders from all nations. Agwamina, not the Gwewak, Kisi and Yok, so the grandmothers and the grandfathers, Musumak and Nuokumak. Agwamina, wow, all of you, and just want to acknowledge all of you as we gather here in the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, the Piikani, and Kainai nations, in the territory of the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the territory of the I can't say it with my throat. Stoney Nakoda, Bears Paw, Chiniki, and Wesley's First Nations, and the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So I'm grateful that I get to be here. I consider myself really fortunate that I was invited to be here. When I applied for this position, within the very start of my position, I went through ceremony to be welcomed here. And I'm deeply grateful. You heard from Reg Croshoe, and he was one who led the ceremony with elders' presence of all the nations for that ceremony. So I'm grateful and acknowledge all of them for allowing us to be here, allowing us to grow and to journey with them in this territory. Land is really important. Land is it's part of who we are. And one of the sayings that I picked up several decades ago was actually on a video, so I'm glad Reg and Rose aren't here because they'd probably give me heck because I didn't hear it in person from the person and who spoke in the video about how when we walk on this land, we're walking on their ancestors, that the top soil of this land, this soil is made up of the bones and the muscles and the nerves and the blood of the ancestors of this land. And so when you walk, I have others who I'm close to who say that every step you take is a prayer. And so I also acknowledge then every step we take, we're being held up by the ancestors of this land. And so I ask you to find out what's meaningful for you in territorial acknowledgements, but meaningful from your heart. Put your mind into it, of course, but make it meaningful because that's what's going to help you carry forward in walking in a good way with our relations of this territory. Nina Muskego Innu. My people are the Swampy Cree, and we're from further east than here. My particular nation is Ochekwisiipi, Fisher River Cree Nation. It's about 2 hours north of Winnipeg. We originally, when we signed treaty, and I'll talk briefly about those pieces in a moment, when we signed treaty, we moved south with the intent of becoming farmers. But the land that we got, you can't grow anything on. Hay might sometimes grows there, but really it's what's called Manitoba gumbo. How many Manitobans here, originally from Manitoba? Boy, we must have a strong presence because I keep running into people from Manitoba. So, with that said, for those who have connection to Manitoba, you would know that you can't grow anything in that Manitoba gumbo, and that's what my reserve is on. And so when we moved with the intent of becoming farmers, when we signed treaty, it wasn't possible. But with that said, we're a very proud people in our community, and I'm very honored to be a citizen of this particular nation. I'm very honored that my culture, my peoples, are the Cree peoples. I'm Nina Gaskitimaegan. My name is Gaskitimaegan. To translate, it's Black Wolf. I don't usually say much about that because I'm part of an old school. And what I mean by that there's a time when we had to hide who we were. We had to hide our identity. We had to hide anything about our culture. We couldn't live our values up front because we're persecuted for it. For example, when my mother spoke Cree in school, they would take clothespins and put them on her tongue. and let her sit there to try and stop her from speaking our Cree language. And that's just one out of many examples. There's worse examples across the country. There's some examples of support, but far more often than not, we were being forced to not be who we were. So part of that was that we used to hide. As ceremonial people, as traditional people, we used to hide to do the things we needed to do to maintain our values, to maintain our sense of who we are, and maintain our practices. I could tell you more stories about that, but I'll leave it at that. That's the reason why I never would say my name that much out in public. But things are changing, and I have some dear friends who run sweat lodges, and they're asked to set up a sweat lodge at another university. And the people at the university says, you could go over there in the bush and you could set it up there. And my friend, who went to residential school for a number of years, stopped and thought, and he says, no, we're done hiding. We'll go right in front in the field here. And I think more and more of our people are saying, we're done hiding. And we need to stop hiding in many ways because our young people need it. And you'll hopefully get a sense of that after I finish speaking. So where I'm going to go for this sharing, for this moment, is that I wanted to go over some of the things that lead up to our Indigenous strategy. And the Indigenous strategy is just a reflection of some of the things that are happening across the country. So it does expand beyond that, but it's also a reflection of how, it's for lack of better words, almost a template on some of the things we could do in our work. And so I'll carry that into some of the things that we've done in One Child, Every Child. So I wanted to speak a little bit about the way we are. And in order to understand the way we are as Indigenous peoples, we need to understand our sense of our values, our practices, our belief systems. Amongst the things to recognize is that there is Indigenous peoples is a catch-all phrase that makes it easy for Canadians and others in the world. Nina, Muskego Inyinu, what's Indigenous? Because Indigenous, I don't emphasize Indigenous. What I am is Swampy Cree. I'm Cree. And in the same way, I could share much with the elders that are here earlier, Reg and Rose, but we're different. And I have to really spend a lot of time learning and respecting the nations that are in this territory. And I'm very careful not to impose my own values and practices and beliefs. But Reg and I will spend much time looking at our parallels between our nations, and it's easy for us to find them, much easier than what I would say finding them with some other nations, and I'll come into that. So a key piece of who we are is that, first of all, we have many worldviews. We share some commonalities, such as being holistic, such as being relational. We emphasize intergenerations. Being intergenerational. Oh no, I'm at my last halls. I think I left them at the table. Oh no, I got them. Never mind, sorry. I'm prepared. We have a commitment to others, so we emphasize reciprocity. I spoke about our commitment to land. These are some of the things that we share. We share our role, that we're in a relationship with other life, that's our role, that we don't see ourselves as separate. Things like the separation of mind and body doesn't it's not a good fit for us, is the way I would say it. And I would go as far as saying I don't think it's a good fit for anybody, but I'm a little biased. We have commitment to others. We have a deep commitment to others, to other nations. And when I say nations in this frame, I don't only mean the nations we create politically as people, but I mean nations of the buffalo, nations of the grasses, nations of the waters, and the mountains. And so these are other nations that we have commitment to. And it's through this commitment and through this holistic relationship that we've come to know how to live a good life. And Minopamatswin is often the phrase that we use in the Cree language. So I'm now diving into some of those things that might be a little different than some of the other nations. Minopamatswin is really important amongst the Cree. It's important amongst the Anishinaabe, but I would probably have to sit down and sit in discussion with elders such as Reg or Virgil Stevens from the Stoney Nakoda, or Diane, oh no, I lost Diane's last name. Diane from Tsuut'ina, I'll say. We would probably have to sit down and talk about what does a good life mean for these other nations? Is it a concept that they use? I want to, in terms of diving into some of those details about our particular nation, there's some things that are important to us. So, for example, we all have different creation stories. And these creation stories become important because they'll influence the way that we think and how we go forward. We see that in Canada. While Canada has many ways of understanding creation in the world, it's influenced significantly by creation stories tied to Christianity. And so we see that in terms of which holidays are we acknowledge, as a simple example. So I don't ignore all of the different dynamics within Canada, but we do have a history in Canada that is framing how we're going forward. And myself as a Cree person has a similar framing, meaning that I'm framed by my own understanding of creation and other stories. And so our creation stories talks about a flame coming from creation or creator, and it's put into every individual. And so the easiest way I could say that is that we all have something, an essence to us. And in that essence, if it's all coming from the same source, we share that essence. And that becomes really important because then you're going to want to emphasize relationship, and you're going to want to work with people in a different way because of that continued connections of that essence and that being emphasized. These stories that we have come out in a number of ways. And so an example, the word Pamatswin, when I say Minopamatswin, the Mino literally means good or well or something positive. Pamatswin is a word for life. Pamatswin I've heard it explained in different ways, but the one that makes the most sense to me is Pime in our language. It's not a word, but it's the way Cree's built is that you have a central word or central phrase and you add on to it. I'll come back to that. So Pime is one of those central pieces, and it implies in succession, one after another. Matisi is your belly button. So now you put those two together, you have one succession after another of belly buttons. And that's what life is to us. So when you think about that, we start paying attention to the importance of generations. And that my life isn't just me, it's all the generations before me and my connection to all the generations to come. But something's really important that, from our perspective, is that nothing is really going to come from my belly button. It's going to come from women. And the belly button is connected to the women, not to the men. And so that also implies how we're going to relate in the world. What is my role as a man if no life is going to come from my belly button, from me? Then what do I need to do in terms of relationships? What do I have to do in terms of making sure life continues? And so my role is impacted by all of that, and our relationships in terms of life coming forward is impacted by all that. We have a number of things like stages of life. I'm not going to get into all of those. I could talk to you about Tikanagans. I could talk to you about the stages of life. I could talk to you about our ceremonies, walking out ceremonies, our fasting ceremonies. But what I will say is that I hope you get a gist that we have an understanding, a way of being in the world that stems from how our stories stems from passing down from one generation to the other, these stories, and putting it in context for today. And that's my role, is that I have to take what's shared with me and figure out how to put it in a particular context. But something happened has happened and is continuing to happen that's impacting me to be able to do that. And so, anybody know what this is? You know what this is called? This picture? It actually has a name. Manifest destiny. And so when you look at the picture, you see in the bright side, coming from one side to the other, people coming in wagons and moving forward, etc. You see farms. And then on the other side, a little bit darker, you see people running away. And if you notice, there's both buffalo and people running away or getting away. And that's what we face and continue to face today. I faced it when I mentioned about our reserve, saying, okay, we'll take up farming. Well, the land we get for reserve, we can't farm in. So there's a continuous push, and I could go into a lot of history about that, but it's important to understand that history. And so I leave that to you to uncover some of those historical pieces. We face this push against us today. So the things that I just shared with you, how readily is that available? What would I have to do to learn it? And if I can't learn it in our systems that we've set up, where do I have to go to learn it? And so does that mean I have even more to learn other than what's offered in the systems? Of course, the systems, the easiest one I refer to is education or health. I have to figure these out, as well as try to maintain my own sense. But that went even further because of that push. And I'll come in a short moment about what I mean by that went even further. What our people recognize with this coming on to us, this push onto us, is that we had to do something about it. And so, it's not on my notes. Oh, there we go. We decided that we had to work in relationship with one another, meaning working in harmony where we're mutually supportive. And this stems from early treaties to Rowampum to our number treaties, to Treaty Number 7, signed in 1877 here. And the agreement was, first of all, what is a treaty about? Is it involve just one person or everybody? So it's going to involve at least everybody who's falling under that treaty. And I would suggest to you that there isn't a person here that does not fall under these treaties. Now, what we tend to do with the treaties is look at the benefits, and I put in quotation marks, that Indigenous peoples receive. You get everything for free, etc. All those kinds of myths. But we never look at what everybody else is getting out of these treaties. Anyone say what the treaties are about? If you have to summarize in a word or two? No. Land and resources. And it's from the land and resources that everything that has been built about Canada, or I would suggest at least touches everything built about Canada, including our institutions, our lights, including our roadways, including our hospitals, including, for those working in university, our paychecks. And so everybody here is probably touched or is touched by the treaties. You've received benefit from those treaties. What I would suggest, though, is that despite these treaties that were signed long ago, the old process has continued. These are the residential schools that impacted my family. So one's in Birtle and one's in Brandon, Manitoba. And we've heard lots about residential schools. I don't need to go through all of them. But it's important to recognize these all happened when we made an agreement to be mutually supportive. In order to address some of the things that's been happening more recently, I would suggest a concept that I see in writing in different ways, but I tried to pull some of these things together under the idea of indigenism. Indigenism has two key prongs to it, and that is a pushback against colonialism, meaning all that push against us, well, we got to push back and make space for that. And that space is about resettling our own traditions, or resetting our own traditions within this context. So if you think about a circle, you push the circle open, and in the center, what you put is those traditions, those values, those practices, those belief systems, etc. It's the simplest way I could explain Indigenism. So it requires both attention to oppression, but also resurgence. Some of the things that happened since these efforts to push against the continued colonialism that's present was recognition of what's happened. And so then we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is how I would have to understand it. Now, let me back up for a brief moment. I'm not fluent in my language. When I talked about my mom putting clothespins on her tongue, what that did is my mom didn't want to teach any of her kids our language because she didn't want us to go through the pain that she went through. And so I started learning as an adult, and I continue to try to learn my language. And get the magus, and I'm pitiful with it, but I'll never stop trying to learn it. It's one of the sacrifices I make in terms of being in university. It slows down my ability to pick up my language because I'm interacting primarily with English speakers and not my own Cree speakers. So concepts of tapwe win, these concepts, peace, working together in harmony, are how I understand reconciliation. And you'll see that some of these things, forgiveness, all of these concepts are all about a relationship. And so that's one of the things why truth and reconciliation makes sense for Indigenous peoples. But if you notice, there's tapwe when I'm only putting one, and that's a key one, is the truth. Because there's a tendency to ignore everything that I said and say, let's get to the answers. And what I would say is that we're building a structure then. If we do that, we build a structure that's easy to knock over. The University of Calgary has utilized the Truth and Reconciliation in the development of its Indigenous strategy. It's utilized other key documents like United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Aboriginal RCAP, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. These documents became important in the development of the Indigenous strategy. There's some concepts within our strategy, and I encourage you, it's available online, I encourage you to take a look at it. What it does is take these concepts, it took the knowledge from the elders, it worked with the knowledge from the elders, such as Reg and Croshu, who are key, but also many other key elders, and they're listed in the back of the strategy. And some of the key concepts that came out was developing the parallel path process to figure out a way to go forward on what we're trying to do, and that was to transform the university. It was recognized that the transformation of the university is an ongoing piece. It's not something that in our ways of evaluating, did you meet your goals, etc. It's not about that. Our goals help us to know if we're on track, perhaps, but our transformation process is ongoing because it's about a relationship. And anybody here married or in a long-term relationship? Well, I'm sure you then have a good idea what would happen if you stop working at your relationship. And so this is our strategy, is that it's ongoing, it's transformational, and it's based upon the idea that we're going to walk side by side together, that we're going to maintain our understandings of our values, our practices, our belief systems, and try to find those connections across our parallel paths as we walk together. It's our way of coming to know one another while still being able to go forward together. It recognizes that it stems from those treaty processes, but it's not just those processes because it's embedded in this land here and the nations here. It emphasizes things like ethical space, and I'm assuming Reg may have mentioned ethical space earlier. And so this is the idea where we have this safe place where we can be who we are and interact with who we are and come to understand the best ways forward. Knowing full well that I will never have a full understanding of everything of somebody on the other path. They're going to have their own experiences, etc. Nor will they understand mine, but we're going to be respectful enough that we're going to keep moving forward. There's values that are shared, such as sanctified kindness, Reg talks about. And sanctified kindness isn't just the kindness between myself and all of you here, but it's the kindness that we show to other life, whether that other life is an ant or whether it's a moose. We're going to have kindness shown towards that. And it's open through meaningful practices. For us, a meaningful practice is a smudge. For others, it may be a call to order. So we learned these concepts of parallel paths, sanctified kindness, ethical space, to figure out how to move forward. And the way that we move forward is we're paying attention to several areas, ways of knowing, ways of doing, ways of being, and ways of connecting. And if you take a close look at that, you'll come to see that there's not a part of the university that's not touched upon. And so now we start seeing that the Indigenous strategy and what we're trying to do, what we're trying to transform, is absolutely everything. If I asked any Indigenous person, what in this room reflects you? I suspect it would be a challenge to find what that means. So in terms of one child, every child, and the parallel paths, what we would be doing is taking in these concepts with what we have proposed. In looking at the well-being of children, we have to start off with a good foundation. So we have to look at the relationships that we have with one another as we're going forward. It was kindly pointed out about the significance of relationships, that when we ignore that, that's when we start, I'll say, dueling with ideas. And so we can't forget that sometimes if we do forget relationships, it doesn't matter about the ideas, that no one's going to be listening to one another. Indeed, I think we're kind of in that spot in this world right now, in terms of we seem to be so disconnected in wanting our way to be the right way and only way. So bringing these concepts about parallel paths into one child, every child, was about recognizing Indigenous peoples, us, First Nations, Métis, Inuit peoples of these lands. We have our own practices and our own experiences. Some of these practices stem directly from our own traditions, and some of these practices stem from our experiences with colonialism. And so as we go forward, we have to be able to address both of those. The intent of one path isn't to fix all of that. The intent is that we're all going to pay attention to that. When I showed you the Indigenism piece, where we had anti-colonialism and we had resetting our ways, well, resetting our ways does have to be done by Indigenous peoples, because it's about our practices, our values, etc. So that makes sense. So that's clearly one path. But pushing back against colonialism, that's done by everybody, because we're all part of it. And so we're all engaged in that, and so both paths have to do that. Well, what does that mean? So it means that when we have a grand study, or sorry, I should rephrase myself, I've got to watch that word grand because it is a particular meeting. If we have a study that's in addressing our entire population, then it truly must reflect that. And so because Indigenous experiences are different, we have to pay attention to how those studies are going to incorporate Indigenous experiences. It's one of our scholars, Indigenous scholars, is focusing on maternal and prenatal health. And one of the things that comes from the work of Indigenous scholars, and particularly Indigenous communities, is that the biggest thing is, why can't women have the opportunity to have birth in their home communities? I know so many people that have to leave their communities by themselves, live somewhere for 6 weeks in order to give birth. Would any women here who have been mothers want to do that? And so if we're going to pay attention in terms of child well-being for everybody on those on those large-scale studies, we got to recognize those realities as well. And so Parallel Paths is going forward to pay attention to the colonial experience and pushing back and address those issues, but also supporting those Indigenous practices. A parallel would be midwives, for example, on how we could make change. So I want a couple points. I think I went longer than I was supposed to, so I'll be really fast on these. There's things to do to prepare for engagement. And the first thing I would say is engagement has to do with an emotional involvement. So that means it has to do with you being involved and reflecting on yourself. I'm going to pass on the other pieces just because of time. And I'm going to say, Kananas Komitin here. And if we could take 5 minutes, I know we're cutting into lunch, for questions, I'd be happy to do that. So thank you, everybody. Yay, I'm free. I really am free. Well,
tangibly within one child, every child, what are the next steps to work together?
so one of the things is having an understanding what both of us are doing on each path. So I know that we've been able to be involved in terms of the writing and that, but I think another key piece is having everybody who's involved with One Child, Every Child come to understand what it is that we're going forward with on the parallel paths and what they may mean. And then it won't be successful unless we're all make a commitment to journeying together. So a piece is sharing what we intend to do, making sure that we're all on the same page so we could start that journey together. Often that means, in terms of the Indigenous side, I talked about engaging things, and so maybe it's a call to order, but we also have processes. And so we have processes for starting new journeys as Indigenous people, so we would have to look at what does that mean to incorporate some of those, whether it's a smudge, for example, and having that explained from the elders.
Okay, so pardon my ignorance, but with these Indigenous scholars, where will they publish, and where can we kind of access the knowledge for people or white persons who want to maybe partake in some Indigenous culture? Will we have access to their findings as well?
Okay. So, asking me where the Indigenous scholars, this respectfully, I'm saying this, is like me asking 10 of you, where do these 10 people, asking you, where do these 10 people publish? It's going to be all over in a variety of journals. And what I would suggest is you could email them, you could write to them, and ask for where, specifically to the team members on where they're publishing in that. One of them's here, Jennifer Makaides. So I'm not sure if our other members have made it in. So there's some members around, and we could get you the names of the team members. The one piece I'd add: there's no such thing as Indigenous culture. Plural cultures.
What is the way of, I guess, accessing or communicating or collaborating with the Indigenous cultures in terms of developing research questions or fitting some of the important research questions that you may have into some of the research that we're doing in child and maternal health?
Well, let's flip that around. Maybe it's looking at what you may have and how it fits into what we're doing. And so those little things like that even is part of that process of understanding a parallel path, because the tendency has been to see it as, okay, we'll get you to fit in here. And that's, whether it's residential schools or something else down the line, that's what's always been asked of Indigenous peoples. And what we're saying is, there's some things, yes, that we would want to fit into, but there's some things, and so for example, if there's a study on long COVID, I want to know about it. But there's some things we want to maintain where we are. And so I'm back to that first piece. It's about the relationship and starting that off in a good way. In order to enter any relationship, you have to understand where yourself is coming from. And so you have to look at your own practices, your own values, your own systems, in order that you could then see what you have and what you're bringing in and what you may be imposing or what you may be able to hold back on before you can even enter a relationship. You could try to enter a relationship, but it'd be weak, I would suggest. One of the key things Indigenous peoples are continuously facing is matters of trust. And so there's a lot of expectation. I just received an email this morning saying, oh, we're doing this and we've got to get this done by next week and we want an Indigenous person involved. Would you be it? We hear that all the time. And how do I know you're not just going to take whatever we have and run away with it and reinterpret it and force fit it into what you want? So it takes time to build that trust and develop that relationship. Mistagosawak, that's from my own language out east. Over here they'll say Moniawak. And so it refers to non-Indigenous peoples, basically.
I had to work hard on that. I had a good teacher.
Mistagosawak. Mystic is trees. And it's the whole word, it ends up referring to the boats that people came over on. Because we originally up by the Hudson's Bay and saw these boats. We also saw the smaller boats coming up the river system.
Michael, thank you very much for an amazing talk. The question I had actually, maybe it's partly been answered by what you said in response to Deb's question. But we've talked a lot during the development of One Child, Every Child about the importance of Indigenous-led research and the importance of Indigenous scholars leading research with Indigenous communities and Indigenous communities driving that research agenda. So from the perspective of a non-Indigenous researcher who has been doing, say, population work in Canada and is now realizing suddenly that maybe there is an Indigenous side to this work that should be explored, where do they start? How do they start to build the relationships that then make their work more relevant to Indigenous communities? In other words, practically, what should those people do now?
So there's different angles that come forward with that. One is first is about establishing relationships. So maybe it's establishing a relationship with your colleagues within the institution you're at, whether it's the hospital or the university. Getting to know the communities of the territory or the territory which your research is located in, or territories, plural, and getting to know those communities. Some of this you could do on your own. It's easy to read up about some of the history pieces, but it has to be validated from the people of those communities. Keeping in mind that many of our own people in our communities haven't had access to the same kind of information that you may be able to access. So there's a lot of give and take and give and take about understanding that happens. And so part of it is doing some of your own homework ahead of time and working with individuals and communities. So if you're to work with me, I'd be impressed if you spend some time understanding about the Cree people and the different dialects and different territories and different ways our cultures have gone, even as Cree people. But also our experience as Cree people, what has influenced us? How is it that we were what would be referred to as middlemen? And I say that purposely in gender and all around. There's a whole history about that. Sarah Carta writes some really good material about the oppression of Indigenous women. So doing some of that work, some of it then involves reaching out and saying, this is what we have and that we're looking at doing. Is there anything here of benefit to you? And so that's a key piece, because too often people are coming with a research agenda and asking you to come aboard without ever knowing what communities or people want. And so if you really want to do some good research, you start off with the relationship, and then you develop what it is that you may want to do together in that relationship. That would be ideal. But I know how research is. Sometimes things move really fast. SSHRC opens up its grant, or CIHR opens up its granting process, and you got to fill something in within a few weeks. So it means you got to develop some of that ahead of time. You got to develop that relationship ahead of time so you could bring forward those ideas saying, this is what they're calling for. Does it fit? No? Okay. Well, I'll let you know when next one's coming up. In the meantime, you keep building up that relationship. So it's a long-term commitment. Does that help? Yeah. I think I'm getting the boot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. So we have a gift for Dr. Hart, and I think he gave us the gift of his thoughts, of his perspective.
Sorry.
That is so important. Please, thank you.
One quick phrase, and I've heard it on YouTube now, but I heard this when I was a boy, when I was about 7 years old. And it has to do with gifts. And so some of people have heard me say this already, that an elder asked me, say, well, what sort of gifts have you received lately? And so a little guy said, well, I got a so-and-so toy. I got to go and do this with play with my toy with these friends. And the elder said, that's really good. And he said, well, what'd your mother get? And so I told the elder what that, and said, that's really nice. And he says, but there's something more precious than that. Do you know what it is? And I thought, and I couldn't think of what it was. And he says, it's life. He says, you could replace that toy. If it's broken, you could replace it. Even a house, you could replace a house. But you can't replace life. That when you give it, you never get that time back. And that when you share it, you have this memory, but you get to walk away with just that memory, that's it. And so it's more precious than anything, so you got to use your time wisely. And so I acknowledge the gift that all of you are giving here, because you're giving a part of your life for us to be together. And that's a gift you can never replace. So thank you, everybody.